With every single age, there is technically an amount of money that you should have saved in order to move on to the next stage in life. If you haven't saved that amount of money yet, that's okay, because in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how much money you should have saved at a certain age, and if you haven't, exactly what steps you need to take in order to get there and ultimately achieve financial freedom. Now, I've worked with over 453 millionaires over the last 7 years as working as a wealth advisor in a top 5 company in the United States, and I've also managed millions of dollars for Gen Zers as well as millennials. So I have a pretty good idea of how much money you really should have on average based on every single mile marker for your age. Let's actually jump in and see how much money you should have saved in your 20s. You're starting to pay it off, but your career income is probably not that much at the moment. Toward the end of your 20s, you're probably hustling hard, you're working hard, you're paying off that debt, which essentially means that your debt is probably going to go down, so your net worth is either zero, or for the average 29-year-old, their net worth is around 7,000 to 8,000 positive. If you haven't achieved a positive net worth yet in your late 20s, here are some steps that you can start today. So first of all, I would say start a budget. In your budget, definitely make sure you track where your money is going. In other words, where are you spending your money? Is it on just your rent or on groceries? In that case, those are basic living expenses. But if you find your money going toward other expenses, such as eating out, vacations, clothes shopping, etc., those are things that are probably not necessarily needed to continue a basic lifestyle standard. Another really easy way to save money is getting a roommate. Rents have become extremely expensive over the last couple of years, especially since COVID. So chances are, if your salary hasn't really caught up with the cost of living increase, you might want to cut down on expenses somewhere. The next step that you can take in order to increase your net worth by the time you're in your late 20s is improving your credit score. One of the things that I want to remind you is that about 50%, that's 50% of your credit score is based on history. Specifically, 35% of your credit score is based on payment history, and then another 15% of your credit score is based on how long you've had that particular credit card or any other type of loan. My recommendation is try to check out some credit cards like Discover, for example, that specifically offer cards for students, and try to start building up credit and credit history. You can do that by simply purchasing like a $10 item every single month, and of course making sure you pay off that item. Another example of building your credit could just be by adding yourself as an authorized user to someone who already has a good credit history, such as a parent or a trusted person. So you essentially gain from their positive credit score. So as an example, a good credit score can possibly reduce your interest rate when you're applying for a mortgage. It can reduce your student loan rate if you're going back to graduate school. Clearly, there are many benefits of starting early with a credit card, paying it off consistently, and really building that credit over a longer period of time. The next step that I would suggest, especially if you're just starting out in your early 20s, is building an emergency savings fund. The average rule of thumb is to have about 3 to 6 months worth of savings in your emergency savings fund. So what that means is if you need, let's say, $2,000 to live each month, which would cover rent, groceries, utilities, etc., then on the low end, you should have about $6,000 saved in cash in an emergency savings fund. And on the high end, you'll probably want about $12,000 saved in an emergency savings fund. Another thing that I would suggest, if you haven't yet attained that $7,000 positive net worth by the time you're in your late 20s, I would probably suggest invest in yourself. Investing in yourself could have many meanings. For example, you could buy books, you could hire a mentor, buy courses, enter a community like my Wealth Suite community where I teach about wealth building strategies, or you could simply get a new certification for your career. The point is, if you invest in yourself, you increase your value, which ultimately increases how much money you will be paid by your employers down the road. And finally, if you've already accomplished all of those items, the next step would probably be to start investing in the stock market, and especially if you are ready to invest, you might want to consider opening a Roth IRA. A Roth IRA is a retirement account where you can put money in, which is taxed, but once you invest it in the Roth IRA, that grows tax deferred, and once you take that money out at 59 and a half, that money is no longer taxed because you already paid taxes on your contribution when you put the money into the account when you were in your early 20s. If you're in your 30s, you'll probably want to save somewhere between $11,753 all the way to $40,000. If you're not there yet, here are some strategies that you can implement today to start building up your savings and net worth. First, pay off all credit cards. If you haven't already paid off your credit cards, now is the time to do so. Remember, your 20s and really your 30s are the foundation for the rest of your life, especially as you get into retirement. So pay off that high interest debt ASAP. The next step is if you have access to a 401k, which is an employer-sponsored retirement plan, it's time to take advantage of that employer match. In other words, if your employer gives you 3% for free, if you contribute 3% of your salary, then you should do that because that's free money essentially. And that's the same thing with an employer match in a 401k. 401ks offer that tax-deferred growth, and then once you're 59 and a half or once you're 65 or whenever you retire, you can take out that money. In fact, you might want to consider contributing to a Roth 401k if your employer offers it. Of course, there are different pros and cons to each, but a Roth 401k allows you to take your money out on the back end without paying any more taxes to the government. The next thing you want to consider is really just making auto investments and auto savings. In my opinion, if it's out of sight, it's out of mind. And the best way to do that is automate everything you do, because the best way to grow wealth is to become a lazy millionaire. If you haven't saved between $11,000 to $40,000 in your 30s, the next step is really getting a firm grip on your budget. Try to buckle down and maybe schedule 30 minutes a week to dig into your budget. Figure out what you're spending and where your money is going. If it's going to things that maybe aren't necessary in your life, try to cut those out and try to use that money to either invest, pay off debt, or to save into your emergency savings fund. So let's talk about how much money you should have saved and invested in your 40s. There are two very different answers here. First, we're going to talk about the median, which is essentially what the middle person in America has saved and invested in their 40s, and that's about $140,000. Now let's talk about the average number, which is about $700,000. Essentially, the average is skewed much more upward, especially if you have millionaires in their 40s. The median is going to be a little bit more representative of what the true American on average has saved in their 40s. If you're not at that $140,000 marker yet, that's okay, but it's really time to start digging into your financial plan. First of all, what I would say is let's try to max out your 401k. The point is you want to max out whatever your employer is giving you. In a 401k, which is typically the most popular type of retirement plan in America, the maximum amount you can contribute is $22,500 if you're under age 50 in 2023. If you're over age 50, then that would be about $30,000 again for the year of 2023. It's time to also open up and start contributing to a Roth IRA or a regular IRA. Now, of course, Roth and regular IRAs, they have different income limits, but the point is make sure you open up one and consider investing in one along with contributing to a 401k. The next thing you want to ask yourself is, do you have access to an HSA, which is a health savings account? The reason why there's a triple tax benefit is because your contributions are tax deductible, your investments are tax deferred, and when you take money out for qualified medical expenses, that's not taxable. So really, it's a trifecta. And even more so, I would suggest if you have access to an HSA, you want to actually use it as another retirement account. In other words, contribute every year, but essentially keep that HSA, don't withdraw from it, and keep it until you're in your retirement years, and then start withdrawing from it as you need medical expenses. It's really one of the best kept secrets out there. In your 40s, you should also take a look at your credit score. If it's under 750, it's really time to dig in and make your credit score improve. Another thing you might want to consider in your 40s is actually investing in real estate. In the United States, real estate has actually increased in value by about 8.8% year over year. Real estate in general is a little bit less volatile than the stock market, and honestly, it's a good way to diversify your overall assets, right? Another thing you might want to consider is actually buying your own home. Over the long term, that is really a great way to build equity as well, especially if that home is your forever home. That's something to start thinking about in your 40s if you haven't already earlier. The next thing you want to start thinking about is really your lifestyle during retirement. It's very important to start to think about what you want your lifestyle to look like in retirement. For example, some questions you need to ask yourself is, how much do you plan to spend in retirement? Where do you want to live in retirement? Would you live in your current house or in the current state, or would you downsize, or would you move out of state to maybe a cheaper place, or maybe even become an expat by living in a different and cheaper country? So as an example, if you come down to the conclusion that you want to spend about $50,000 a year during retirement, then that means that you'll probably need to have at least $1 million saved and invested in the stock market. Keep in mind, if you want to live off of $50,000 a year, there are several things you want to keep in mind. First, let's say you have $1 million saved and you're 65 and you're about to retire. The average amount of money that you would get from dividends is about 3% of your invested assets. That would mean you'd probably earn about $30,000 before taxes are taken out per year from $1 million invested dollars. Clearly, $1 million is definitely the minimum that you want to have saved if you want to live off of $50,000. If you have $140,000 saved right now in your 40s, you're still going to have a ways to go to save $1 million in retirement. In other words, you'll need to be saving about $860,000 over the next 25 years in order to reach that minimum goal of $1 million. The median amount of money that should be saved in your 50s is between $312,000 to about $400,000. In other words, we're talking about 6 to 7 times of your annual income that should be saved and invested. If you're not there yet, then I'm really sorry to break it to you, but you gotta start investing. Make sure you contribute everything you can to your 401k. Take advantage of that employer match. Contribute to an IRA if you haven't already, and also make sure you contribute to an individual taxable brokerage account. The next thing that you gotta do is really start a budget if you haven't already, and try to cut that unnecessary spending. Start a budget on Excel and really track every single cent, even if you spend money on like a chewing gum. And if Excel isn't your forte, that's okay. There are apps out there like Mint, for example, or even YNAB, which is called You Need a Budget. In fact, I have a link below that you can click on for YNAB, and it really does a good job tracking your spending, visualizing your spending as well, and kind of putting it into categories and get to know where your money is going so you can save it and use it for wealth building purposes. If you're in your 50s and you haven't really made that $312,000 to $400,000 net worth goal yet, then I would also say it's time to start hiring a financial advisor. Financial advisors, honestly, I think about it in the way of you're paying a little bit of money to make a lot of money in the long term. If you do hire a financial advisor, there are some things you want to keep in mind. Number one, make sure they're a CFP, a certified financial planner. And number two, ask them if they are a fiduciary. They need to do what is in your best interest by law. If they are a fiduciary, then in theory at least, they shouldn't be selling you commission products or anything else that would make them a lot of money. They would be making sure that you do what is in your best interest. In fact, fiduciaries oftentimes don't sell any products. They just give you recommendations. In your 50s, you also want to see if you can build up the number of income streams that you have. Ideally, you probably want to have between 2 to 5 income streams, which means your primary job, maybe some dividends generated, maybe some interest from high yield savings accounts, maybe from a side hustle, or maybe your spouse is working as well. The next step, if you haven't made that $312,000 to $400,000 cutoff in your 50s, is really revamping your lifestyle. In other words, if you live in a big house, you probably want to consider downsizing or getting a roommate maybe. If you live in a very expensive state that has a high cost of living, you might want to consider moving outside of the city. All right, and finally, we're in our 60s. The median amount of money that the average American has saved in their 60s is between $500,000 to $700,000. That equals about 10 to 15 times of the average American's salary. On average, when I coach clients live about 30 years after retirement because we have better technology, we have superior medicine. So what that means is we need the money that we save and invest to also last longer. If you haven't achieved this $500,000 to $700,000 net worth yet and you're in your 60s, it's probably going to be a little difficult to get there, but there are a couple of things you can do. So first, let's talk about Medicare. Medicare in general is supposed to bring down the cost of medical expenses for you. This is something something that I would probably consider signing up for, but I would do some research because every person's situation is different. So you want to make sure the Medicare plan that you take matches your health situation. Those are some planning topics that you want to consider asking your financial advisor, but at least here you know what the age frame is for when you want to take a benefit. Another thing when you're in your 60s that you might want to see as a goal is paying off your house. So let's say you did buy a house in your 40s, you probably want to start paying it off, or at least getting close to paying it off in your 60s. And the reason why is really just from a mental standpoint. If you have no more income because you retired, but you still have a pretty big chunk going out toward your mortgage in your 60s or 70s, that can kind of cause people unrest, right? They can be a little restless because they don't have that income necessarily to pay off that mortgage. That's why it's always nice to pay everything off, actually own your house, and have that big piece of equity. You could always tap into that equity at a later point through a home equity line of credit or a reverse mortgage even, but the point is you own the asset yourself, the bank doesn't own it. So that is another benefit of actually paying off your house in your 60s. Another thing that you might want to consider if you're in your 60s is actually saving more, because chances are the kids are out of the house, you're not paying for any more college costs, you're probably at your peak earning years. So you want to take advantage of that as well, which is why you might want to try to save as much as you can in your 60s before you start entering your retirement years. And finally, if you haven't already, this is really a time you might want to consider working with a financial advisor. For example, financial advisors could help you make Roth conversions during your low income years, such as your retirement years, but before your RMDs or your required minimum distributions start. Roth conversions are a great way to essentially save on taxes in the long run and essentially pass money to heirs on a much lower tax bracket. As a disclaimer, remember that all of these numbers that I gave you as it relates to your age range is simply a ballpark and a guideline. I don't know your situation. You might be completely ahead, or maybe you're not there yet. And if you're not, at least you know now a couple of the strategies that you can take today in order to get your way and accelerate it back on track. Remember, how much you make doesn't necessarily matter. What matters is how much you keep, because you could be earning $1 million a year, but you could also be spending $1 million a year. So in reality, you wouldn't be better off than someone who is maybe making $50,000 a year, but actually only spending $40,000 a year. In fact, that person would be off much better than the person making $1 million a year. So remember, if you're not there yet, learn about budgeting, learn about saving, and maybe learn about the money mindset when it comes to spending money. If you want expert guidance and you want to have someone to help you achieve your financial goals, click on my email in the link description below, where I can work together with you and actually build a step-by-step financial plan designed for your situation.